So one issue with cities in India is that the shift in terms of demography, the shift in terms of scale has been so big that planning has become rearguard action. It's not avant-garde action. Yeah? It's not about speculation. It's not about thinking of the future, because the problems are catching up with you so fast that you don't have the time to think about the future because it's all on emergency mode. So that's fundamental. The second, I think, issue about cities is just the imagination, which is that we have, through the Corbusian model, through the British colonial rule, the paradigms that we've looked at to imagine cities are Western paradigms. And I think we need to rethink this. You know, what is theory? Theory becomes the basis for education, and theory is but a reflection of what happens on the ground. That is, you make sense of something and theorize it, right? As a way that if I theorize a particular condition, then if you haven't seen the patterns, it will be useful for you to operate, right? And then it gets embedded in curriculum as a mode of dispersing that knowledge, etc. Now, the curriculum and theory that we are using comes from an industrializing West. It's based on the paradigms of an industrializing West. It's amazing. And those are the same theories. We look at the garden city idea. We look at the... But right now the action is on the ground in India and China. We should be reflecting on these conditions, and we should be constructing theory from that. And therefore the temporal landscape, the ephemeral, the notion that architecture is not the spectacle of the city. What is the theoretical construct that gives us, which then informs theory, and therefore then informs education and curriculum? The theory of the future has to come out of the challenges of what's happening on the ground in India, China, and then next Africa. You know, the research I'm working on, I call it the Kinetic City. We need to think of cities in terms of transitionary landscapes, which means then the temporal dimension becomes very important, the ephemeral becomes very important. We should be using space on a temporal way, because that's the way you can make this transition without locking yourself into one solution. Design with time. What does time mean in design? And what do transitions mean? You know, India is gone nuclear from fossil fuels, but India wants to aspire to go to renewables. But India can't jump from fossil fuels to renewable, so it makes the transition through nuclear. And so when we start thinking about the urban in terms of transitions, then sometimes you go in a different direction to come to what you eventually want. And I believe the transitions in India will be made by taking the temporal landscape more seriously and by imagining time in much more rigorous ways within the discourse of planning. So urban design and planning in India can't be only product object oriented, and therefore this is in a way challenges architecture, because architecture is about the static city. But for Indian cities to survive, the static is not the answer. It's only one component, the temporal occupation. The richest people have weddings on the Maidans, and the weddings are erected there in 24 hours and dismantled. Those are the richest people. They don't go into some silly box into which they get weddings done. And so I think we have to take the temporal landscape much more seriously, for two reasons. One is I believe it's cultural, and for the climate and for the culture, but also because it helps us make this transition on a temporal scale in a kind of ephemeral way. And you know, to take this more broadly, I think my critique of planning around the world is that it has no ability to deal with time. So we look at end state planning, you know, and end state planning then begins to inform urban design in a particular way. And to make end state planning instrumental, architecture gets co-opted in that process to represent what that end state will be. And then you lock yourself into a paradigm in the process of making those large investments. And so I think in the Indian condition, I would say architecture is not the only player in the making of the urban. You can't think the urban in India through architecture. Architecture comes there. Whereas in the West, you think the urban through architecture, because the static city, and it might have to do with climate, it might have to do with culture, it might have to do with other things. So I think this is a major paradigm, or a radical paradigm shift that one would have to make. And we should think about it. We recently studied the Kumbh Mela. I don't know if you know about that project, about the temporary city for the festival. And it was called Mapping the Ephemeral Megacity. And there the governance system is also temporal, that at different stages of the construction, the relationships within the government are different. And so temporality there gets taken into governance structures, which is fantastic. So that's a megacity. Imagine if someone came to you and said, design me a megacity for 55 days, you wouldn't know where to start. But here they do it every 12 years. And it's incredible. And so it has to do with materiality in the ways, how do you use materials? The whole city there is built on a sandbank. There's no foundation. It just sits on the ground and it goes away. It's recycled. So it has to do with temporality, it has to do with governance, what are the past structures, how they can shift. And it would need new imaginations, new materials, how they're put together, how they're taken apart. That's fantastic for flux. Why do we want to, leave our trace for so long? That means you actually design buildings that have an expiration date, like a can of soup. And so if a client comes to you and says, I have a need for a company for 30 years, I don't want to make a legacy, I want to retire in 30 years, I want this to go away. That's a light footprint. All this stuff on LEEDs and green buildings is complete nonsense. So look at American suburbia, look at shopping malls, they're being deconstructed now. But these are expensive but brittle solutions. Human beings tend to swing from one extreme to the other. We become capitalists, become communists, we don't come halfway. One is the other is right. So we see the world in black and white, we see the world in binaries, and this is half the problems in the world. I think for me, the informal city as a category is a waste of time for designers. It came out of informal economies. We've co-opted into informal cities. But when you set up these binaries, then you get forced to live in one of the binaries, and then you reinforce the position of the binaries. I believe that it's the simultaneous validity of these that are important. So we need permanent cities as much as we need temporary cities. It's not one or the other, it's both, which makes it even more exciting, because then the city becomes an armature for life. It's not only just the city as in the built city, the city beautiful, which is what Vienna was about. And what happened was man was always temporal in his existence. And then as you began to have great agriculture, the cities became instruments to distribute the surplus wealth of agriculture, and they could be static because the agriculture was in motion. And the city beautiful came out of that, where building and objects defined the artifact of the city. But what it did was it separated people. It then ended up in zones. The poor lived somewhere, the rich lived somewhere. Things got internalized within the architecture. The public realm became less noticeable. And so you needed festivals and carnivals, and you needed the Christmas festival, you needed street markets to bind people together. And the American downtown is about that. People live in these stars, there's nothing in the public realm. So the question is, how do you use the static city? How do you use architecture? But how far do you go with it? How do you leave the space for life, for temporality, to also occupy this? So it's a matter of designing for both. It's not one or the other. And that's the big challenge. These hybridities, these middle grounds, this blurring of the binaries, because the binaries are otherwise always oppositional. You become the champion of the informal city, you become the architect of the people and the poor, and you work in Dharavi and you represent this. That is one extreme. That's not how we'll find solutions. Or you become the architect of developers and you build for fat cats and do rich people's homes. Even though they might look like poor people's homes, you begin to fetishize an aesthetic. It doesn't solve the problem. And that's why I think also architects have to eventually move between the city and architecture. So in the same way as we have to blur the binary of the rich, the poor, the state, the private, the formal, the informal, we also have to, as architects, blur the kind of binary between the city, urban design, planning and architecture, because to reinforce any one of these is not productive, and I think that will be the big challenge.